Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're attempting something like legal archaeology. We're trying to investigate that foundational moment, really, in the history of justice.
You mean the moment when law stopped being secret?
Exactly. When the arbitrary power of the elite was basically forced to write its rules down. That moment, way back in the early Roman Republic, gave us the legendary law of the 12 tables.
Right, and that event, actually inscribing the laws in the forum, that was genuinely revolutionary. It established this absolutely crucial precedent, legal equality, at least in theory.
The plebeians really pushed for it, didn't they?
Oh, they had to. They desperately needed to neutralize the secretive, unpredictable judgments of the patrician magistrates. Suddenly, you had a situation where all citizens were, notionally anyway, subject to the same knowable legal framework.
And it became the bedrock of Roman society for centuries, didn't it? I mean, every schoolboy supposedly had to memorize it.
That's the tradition, yeah.
But here's the interesting twist for our deep dive today.
Hmm.
While we sort of set out to study the original tablets themselves, the sources we actually have are, well, they're different. They're fragments from the great Roman jurists, people like Gaius, Ulpian, and then the later big codification under Justinian.
Exactly. So what we're holding isn't like a simple snapshot of the 5th century BC. It's more like an X-ray, isn't it?
An X-ray. How so?
Well, it reveals the fundamental legal philosophy that, really defined Rome for 1,000 years. These later sources, they show us the underlying principles, the really intricate, sometimes quite rigorous, and often, frankly, brutal legal structures that govern Roman life.
So family life, property, personal liability, all that stuff.
All of that. We get to see how the basic ideas laid down supposedly by the tables were interpreted, expanded, sometimes twisted across the centuries.
Okay, so our mission today is a bit different than planned. We're using these later fragments to try and uncover the core Roman legal mindset.
That's the plan.
We'll navigate through, let's say, 3 major themes that jump out from the sources. First, that absolute, almost non-negotiable structure of the Roman family, all centered on patria potestas.
Ah, yes, paternal power.
Second, the intense Roman obsession with succession inheritance, which apparently led to the invention of the will, a pretty revolutionary idea.
Hugely influential, yes.
And finally, how Roman delictual law defined personal wrongdoing, injury, insult, sometimes with stunning, almost baffling technical precision.
Right. And then we'll try to wrap it up by placing these, very strict legal principles into the broader political context. The Roman Empire wasn't just about neat laws, was it?
Definitely not. We'll look at the contrast between the stability, maybe, of Roman law and the deep corruption and volatility that often characterized Roman governance, especially concerning imperial authority.
Sounds like a good roadmap.
Okay, let's dive in. Let's start right where Rome started, the family. And that phrase you mentioned, patria potestas, paternal power. Our sources don't just frame this as, like, cultural influence. It's presented as an institutional, absolute legal structure.
That's the absolute key distinction, I think. The entire foundation of Roman kinship wasn't really blood, not primarily. It was defined by this concept of agnation.
Agnation. Okay, what does that mean in practice?
It's the idea that kinship, your legal family, is defined strictly and solely by submission to the same paternal power, the same patria potestas. It's a definition based on legal submission, not necessarily biological connection. And understanding this is just crucial for getting your head around Roman society.
So it's all about who holds the power over you legally. If kinship is limited by the legal power of the father, the paterfamilias, what are the immediate, sort of tangible consequences for a Roman citizen living under that system?
The consequences are remarkably consistent, actually. Where potestas begins, kinship begins. Simple as that. So this is why adoptive relatives are fully 100% recognized among the kindred. They're legally brought under the father's power, so they achieve full agnatic standing.
Right.
They are family, legally speaking.
Right. Adoption makes them legally equivalent to a biological child under power.
Exactly. But conversely, and this is where it gets maybe a bit shocking to us,
Yeah.
where potestas ends, kinship also ends.
Completely. So emancipation.
Yes, exactly. A son who is formally emancipated by his father, and this was a complex legal act, like a triple sale, basically setting him free from control, he loses all rights of agnation. He is legally cut off from his original family, gone.
Even if he's the firstborn son, the biological heir.
Even then,
Yeah.
legally he becomes a stranger to his own family of birth regarding agnatic rights, like inheritance under the oldest civil law. The law prioritized that clear legal structure over the blood tie in a way that's, Hard for us to really grasp today.
So you could have a really successful, high-ranking guy. Maybe he was emancipated to pursue a big public career or command an army.
Mm.
And if his father died suddenly without a proper will, that son, despite all his achievements, despite being, his son, was legally out. No inheritance.
Under the strict early civil law governing intestacy, that's right, no share, the legal severance was absolute, which tells you just how much Rome valued this idea of clear, singular jurisdiction, no ambiguity allowed.
Wow. And this rigid principle, you mentioned it, also systematically excluded female descendants from the structure of archaic kinship and succession.
Yes, that follows the same logic.
Tell us a bit more about that exclusion. Why was it necessary, in their view, to legally obliterate the connection through the mother's side?
Well, the jurists, looking back, basically said that the smooth organization of early Roman society would have been, quote, confounded if individuals could claim kinship through their mother's relatives. The logic was purely about jurisdiction, about power.
How so?
Well, think about it. Once a woman married kumanu, that's a type of marriage where she passed fully into her husband's legal control, essentially becoming like a daughter to her husband's father.
You're right.
Her children immediately fell under the patria potestas of her husband's father, not her own father. So, if she also retained legal ties to her birth family, and worse, if her children retained ties through her to her family, well, now you've got a potential mess.
You mean a single person might be subject to two different family authorities?
Exactly. A single person might be legally answerable in some ways to two distinct patria potestates at the same time, and Rome just could not tolerate that kind of jurisdictional confusion. The law preferred absolute clarity of control above pretty much everything else. Cut the ties cleanly.
It sounds incredibly rigorous, almost clinical. How did this Roman system stack up against, say, Athenian norms? Athens was their great rival in antiquity. Did the Athenian idea of curia, paternal authority, mirror this sweeping, absolute Roman power?
That's where we see a really sharp contrast. Athenian curia definitely meant strong paternal authority, no doubt about it. But it was never absolute in quite the same way as Roman patria potestas. Athenian law was, well, it was designed to maintain lineage and property differently, especially when it came to women.
Differently how? How did that actually play out in practice?
Well, in Athenian law, a woman actually retained certain rights of inheritance, limited maybe, but crucial in her birth family, her oikos. That connection wasn't just severed completely upon marriage like in Rome, especially with kumanu marriage.
Okay, so she kept some link back.
Yes. And critically, these rights, these connections, were strong enough that they could actually descend to her children, even though those children belonged legally and politically to their father's oikos.
Wait, hang on. So the Athenian system let a mother's family connection transmit inheritance rights to her kids, even though those kids were legally part of the father's house.
Precisely. That difference, it might seem subtle, but it's profound. It clearly demonstrates that Athenian curia wasn't really comparable to the sort of all-encompassing, legally severing nature of Roman patria potestas.
So the Roman system was designed to, what, wipe the slate clean?
Pretty much. Make the woman fully a legal member of her husband's family legally. It was often described as if she were his own daughter, and that just guaranteed single, unambiguous jurisdiction for her and any kids she had. Athens allowed for more overlapping connections. Rome demanded clean breaks for legal clarity.
Fascinating difference. Okay, let's circle back quickly to the 12 tables themselves. Our sources mention them later on in the context of creating something called statutory tutelage for patrons. This sounds like another example of the law defining relationships of, well, control, even after someone's been freed.
Absolutely. You've hit on another key aspect. The system of statutory tutelage guardianship essentially was directly linked to the legal inheritances that the 12 tables apparently bestowed upon patrons.
So the patron freed the slave, and the law gave the patron inheritance rights and guardianship rights.
Exactly. It was a way to make sure the patron retained an enduring, legally enforceable interest in both the property and, to some extent, the person of the freed man or freed woman. Freedom wasn't always a complete break, legally speaking.
Who was designated as the tutor, the guardian, in this relationship? Was it always the person who did the freeing?
Yes, it was always the person who performed the formal act of manumission. And this held true whether the patron granted freedom voluntarily out of goodwill, or even if the patron was compelled to grant freedom through something called a fidei commissum.
A fidei commissum. That's like a trust, right? Set up by a previous owner in their will.
Exactly. So even if the current owner was legally obliged by a will to free the slave, they still became the tutor upon doing so.
What if the freed person achieved freedom through some kind of special decree, maybe the state stepping in? Did the old owner still get tutelage rights?
Remarkably, yes. Even then, that legal tether often remained. Our sources confirm that even if someone gained freedom through a special imperial decree, there's an example involving the Emperor Marcus Aurelius. The person who actually performed the physical act of manumission still became the statutory tutor.
So the state might force the outcome freedom, but it still respected the legal relationship established by the act of freeing someone.
That seems to be the principle. It cemented the manumitter's lifelong authority, or at least influence. It really speaks volumes about Roman legal thinking. The relationship, once established, is paramount.
And could you have multiple tutors, say if several people co-owned and freed a slave?
You could, yes. But again, with qualifications that really reinforce the patriarchal system, if multiple patrons took part in the manumission, they were all technically designated as tutors. However, if a woman was among those patrons, only the males were actually appointed as active tutors with legal authority.
Of course.
Once again, legal authority, the right to manage the dependents' affairs, their property was strictly reserved for men, even when you get into the complexities of later imperial law. This whole intricate system of statutory tutelage just underscores that Roman law was fundamentally this web of strictly defined and enforced power and dependence.
Okay, so we've established that the father's absolute power, patria potestas, dictates the living family. Now, how did the Romans manage the potential chaos, the social disruption, when that absolute power suddenly ended through death? This takes us right into inheritance, succession, and why the will became so incredibly important.
Yeah, what really stands out in the sources is this profound, almost visceral, cultural, and legal aversion to dying intestate.
Meaning without a valid will.
Exactly. And this aversion, it seems to have been deeply felt throughout Roman history, but maybe especially in the early Republic. Why? Because the rules of intestate succession, if you died without a will, were devastatingly strict under the old civil law.
Why so strict? Why was intestacy so terrifying back then?
Well, the rules were just incredibly unforgiving by our standards. If a Roman citizen died without a will, the inheritance passed only to sui heredis.
Sui heredis, meaning?
Meaning the unemancipated children who were directly under his patria potestas at the exact moment of his death.
Okay, so what about the others?
This means the emancipated son, the one we talked about earlier, who was legally disconnected. He had no share, none whatsoever in the inheritance under that early civil law, regardless of his birthright or his relationship with his father.
That is just deeply counterintuitive, isn't it? You could have a loyal, successful son. Maybe you freed him yourself so he could run a province or something. And if you died unexpectedly, without getting your will sorted, he was legally a stranger, received nothing from your estate. That must have created huge incentives not to emancipate your sons.
Absolutely, or at least to be extremely careful about having a will if you did. The system was fundamentally designed to reinforce that specific agnatic legal family structure. Now, if there were no silly headies, no children under power...
Yes, who got it then?
The estate passed only to the nearest grade of agnatic kindred again, those relatives still linked through unbroken male lines of descent from a common ancestor who held potestas.
Still sticking to that male line of power.
Totally. And crucially, anyone linked through female descent think the children of a sister or even a daughter who had married out cum manu, they were entirely excluded from intestate succession under the old law.
So the civil law basically preferred the family estate be lost entirely, maybe go to distant male cousins rather than pass through a female line.
That seems to be the implication, because allowing inheritance through females might, again, introduce that dreaded jurisdictional confusion or dilute the purity of the agnatic structure. Clarity in male lineage trumped all.
So if the rules for dying without a will were potentially this destructive to, natural family ties and maybe even commercial continuity, it's no wonder the will emerged as such a vital Roman innovation. What did the will fundamentally achieve that was so transformative for them?
Well, our sources, particularly Sir Henry Maine, who's quoted, rightly list the will, alongside the contract, as exercising perhaps the greatest influence in transforming human society. But we need to understand its original function in Rome. It wasn't primarily about just, divvying up your stuff, your money, and goods like we think of it today.
Okay, so what was the original purpose then?
The will originally was a mechanism for the transfer of governance. It was how the deceased could nominate a new chief, a successor who would take up the representation of the household, the familia, and all its duties. That included the vital religious rites, the sacra.
So the property just followed the leadership.
Pretty much. The goods followed this transfer of imperium, the authority within that miniature state that was the Roman family. It was about ensuring continuity of the family unit as a legal and religious entity.
That really reframes it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It moves the will from being just a financial instrument to being almost a constitutional one for the family, ensuring the familia continued.
Yes, precisely. And this goal, this need for continuity, is exactly why the Roman will mirrors archaic adoption practices you find in many ancient societies. Think about Hindu law, for instance. Adoption was often used simply to prevent the family line from being completely broken, ensuring the sacred rites, the sacra, were performed by someone.
So Rome just formalized that need.
Rome essentially, yeah, you could say they digitized and legalized that necessity. They moved it from being maybe a ceremonial adoption ritual to a flexible, written legal instrument, the will. This allowed Romans to effectively sidestep the iron cage of those harsh intestacy rules and ensure that, say, a favored emancipated son, or maybe even a capable outsider, could legally take over the family's representation and, consequently, its property.
Okay, now moving into later Roman law, things obviously got more complex. We encounter this mechanism called the fideicommisum, the trust. This sounds like the point where Roman law started needing more flexibility, ways to get around the rigid framework of direct inheritance.
That's a good way to put it. The fideicommisum started out originally as just a charge or a request, basically a non-legally binding appeal to the conscience, the good faith, fidesz, of the designated heir.
Asking them to do something.
Yeah, asking them to restore some property to another person. Often, this was someone who couldn't legally inherit under the strict civil law. Maybe women in certain situations, foreigners, those emancipated children we talked about.
So it was a moral obligation at first.
Initially, yes. But over time, especially under the empire, these trusts became legally enforceable. They evolved into the kind of trust we might recognize today, a way to direct assets outside the main inheritance channel.
This sounds like a way for the deceased to kind of challenge the absolute control of the paterfamilias from beyond the grave, creating obligations that outlived his power.
That's exactly right. It allowed the testator, the person making the will, to micromanage their property distribution after death. They could charge the heir to restore specific things, money, a particular farm, even, as you mentioned, grant freedom to a specific slave.
But surely this created problems. What if the heir just didn't do it?
Oh, absolutely. This flexibility came with massive legal headaches, mostly revolving around whether the heir would or even could actually comply with the trust instructions.
So how did the jurists handle failures to comply?
They developed some pretty sophisticated rules. They tried to uphold the testator's intent, but also be fair to the heir. Consider the issue of impossibility. What if the heir can't fulfill the trust?
Right.
Our sources cite a case. A beneficiary is asked via a trust and a will to free a specific slave. But the slave's owner, who is some third party, simply refuses to sell the slave to the beneficiary. So the beneficiary physically cannot free the slave as requested.
So what happens? Does the beneficiary lose their own legacy because they failed?
No. The jurist rules that the beneficiary still receives whatever legacy was left to them. The law doesn't penalize the beneficiary for a failure that was genuinely beyond their control. What mattered was the beneficiary's intent and capacity to perform, not necessarily the external outcome if it was blocked by someone else.
That actually sounds quite equitable, quite fair. It suggests a move away from just pure formalism towards considering the intent behind the actions.
Indeed, there is definitely an element of that developing. But these trusts also created a very practical problem. If the deceased person put too many obligations on the heir, asking them to restore too much property to various beneficiaries,
The heir might just say, forget it.
exactly. The heir might refuse the entire inheritance just to avoid the hassle or the potential debt involved in carrying out all these trusts. And if the main heir refused the inheritance, the whole will, including all the trusts within it, failed completely.
So the law had to step in to protect the heir's own interest, just to make sure the trust system itself could actually function.
Precisely. This tension led to laws establishing that the heir had to receive a certain minimum portion of the estate, often referred to as the quarta falcidia, a quarter free and clear. This was specifically to incentivize them to actually accept the inheritance and therefore carry out the trusts attached to the rest of it. It ensured that the flexibility granted by the trust didn't just cause the whole system to collapse because no one wanted to be the heir.
Smart. But even with this move toward flexibility through trusts, were there still absolute limits? Things you just couldn't bequeath or demand? Things that honored those original rigid principles of patria potestas? You mentioned earlier that houses intended to be demolished couldn't be bequeathed, for instance.
Yes, the foundational relationships, the core power structures, remained pretty much inviolable. A father, for example, could not be legally compelled to emancipate his own children, even through the legal weight of a fideicommisum in someone else's will. The jurists declared flatly that parental power, patria potestas, does not permit valuation. You can put a price tag on a field, a table, or even a slave in Roman law. But the relationship of patria potestas itself, that was considered legally sacred, priceless. It couldn't be legally bought, sold, or mandated away via a trust instrument.
So that really confirms the legal hierarchy, doesn't it? Even the sophisticated legal tools developed later, like the trust, ultimately had to yield to the absolute authority of the living paterfamilias over his immediate family. The will was an extraordinary invention, hugely powerful, but it still operated within those fundamental guardrails established by the early republic's view of family power.
Absolutely. The core structure remained incredibly resilient.
Okay, let's transition now. We've looked inside the family power and property transfer. Now let's look at how Romans defined wrongdoing and liability between people. This brings us to their delictual law. Let's start with damage to property, which was primarily governed by a famous law, the lex Aquilia.
Right, the lex Aquilia. This was the main statute for centuries for recovering damages when someone wrongfully harmed your property. And it's famous, or perhaps infamous, for its technical, sometimes counterintuitive application, especially when it came to injuries suffered by freemen.
Freeman, you mean non-slaves?
Yes. A free man, a Roman citizen, or other free person could not bring a direct action for injury to himself under the main clauses of the lex Aquilia.
Why on earth not? Surely hitting a free man was worse than breaking a pot.
Logically, yes. But the legal reasoning is a perfect, if slightly mind-bending, demonstration of Roman formalism. The direct action under the lex Aquilia was fundamentally designed for damage done to things that were owned, property.
Okay.
And as the jurist stated with brutal clarity, no one is deemed to be the owner of his own limbs. Since a free man could not legally be property, he couldn't sue for damage to himself as property using the direct action meant for property.
So their commitment to legal categories was so absolute, they preferred this really convoluted approach rather than just admitting a freeman could, in some sense, own his own body or physical integrity.
Pretty much, yes. They maintain the consistency of the legal category by creating a clever workaround. The injured freeman received what was called an actio utilis, an analogous action, sometimes translated as a useful action or even a legal fiction.
Legal fiction.
Yeah, it basically allowed him to recover compensation for his physical injuries and losses, but the suit was framed as if the freeman were an item of property that had been damaged. The law essentially shoehorned personal injury into the existing framework of property law to make it fit the statute.
That's a stunning philosophical reflection on the Roman legal mind, isn't it? All about fitting things into the right boxes. So if you did own the property, who could actually sue for damage under the lex Aquilia? Was it just the official owner?
No, it wasn't just the technical owner, the dominus. It was generally anyone who had a demonstrable economic interest in the object that was damaged. This broadened the scope quite considerably.
So, like who?
Well, for instance, a pledge, someone holding the property as security for a loan, could sue if it was damaged. A tenant farmer could sue if, say, his crops were destroyed because he lost his livelihood. Or a usufructuary, someone with the right to use and take the fruits of a property, like living in a house, could sue if the house was damaged. All of these people suffered a direct financial loss, regardless of who held the ultimate title deed.
That makes practical sense. What if the ownership was sort of in limbo, like an inheritance that hadn't been formally claimed yet by the heir?
The law had an answer for that temporary legal vacuum, too. If a slave belonging to an unclaimed inheritance, what they called a hereditas iacens, a lying inheritance, was killed or injured.
Yes. Who sues them?
The inheritance itself was legally deemed to be the owner in the interim period. It acted as a sort of legal placeholder. This clever trick ensured that the eventual heir, once they formally accepted the inheritance, could then step in and sue to recover damages for the harm done to the slave while the estate was ownerless. Again, the law finds a way to ensure accountability even when the immediate proprietor is technically absent or undecided.
Always finding a way to make the system work.
Sure.
Okay, let's shift from property damage to inuria. Now, this is usually translated as injury, but as our sources, particularly Gaius, show, it covered a massive range of acts, much broader than just physical harm, right?
Oh, much broader. We'd probably classify a lot of it today under headings like assault, defamation, slander, libel, even harassment. The scope was remarkably wide.
So what were some of the most striking examples of things that counted as actionable in Uria?
Well, it definitely included physical battery being struck by a fist or hit with a club or a whip. That's the obvious part. But it quickly moved into the realm of protecting dignity, reputation, and social standing. Actionable in Uria included public abuse, what they called connuitium. This wasn't just any insult. It involved noisy public shouting matches aimed at humiliating someone. It also covered things like knowingly posting someone's property for sale under the false claim that they were a debtor, a direct attack on their financial reputation.
So they were already dealing with quite sophisticated forms of, like, white-collar slander or reputational damage back then.
Absolutely. And it went further. It explicitly extended to writing slanderous pamphlets or even poetry, clear precursors to our modern laws of libel and defamation.
Poetry. You could get sued for writing a nasty poem.
If it was deemed slanderous and insulting, yes. But perhaps most revealing about Roman social hierarchy were the special protections afforded to certain individuals. Harassing a respectable mother of a family, a mater familias, or a young boy wearing the praetexta.
That's a special toga worn by aristocratic youth, right?
Yeah, exactly. Those acts constituted a particularly high grade in Uria. Why? Because they were seen as challenging the dignity and integrity of vital components of the Roman state and social order. The law recognized a heightened need to protect those who held high social status but might have limited political or physical power themselves.
So the status of the victim really dictated the severity of the offense, legally speaking.
Very much so. And this links back to patria potestas. How did a man claim for an injury or insult directed at his dependents, those under his power?
Good question. How did that work?
The father was seen to suffer the injury through his children, who were still in his power, or through his wife if she was in his legal control, in manu. And here's where the power structure really shines through. For an insult suffered by his son, who was still under his patessus,
Yeah.
the father could bring two separate sets of legal proceedings, two distinct lawsuits.
Two. For the same incident.
Yes. One lawsuit was brought on behalf of the son, nominally for the physical or emotional harm done directly to him. But the second lawsuit was brought by the father, on his own behalf, for the affront caused to his patria potestas, the insult to his authority and his household's dignity.
So the law actually monetized the father's offended authority, separately from the son's actual pain or suffering. That's relentless.
It shows how central that concept of paternal authority was. Now, what about a slave? Could a slave suffer in Uria in Roman law?
Given what we've heard about slaves being property, I'm guessing no.
You guessed correctly. Crucially, a slave could not suffer in Uria himself. As property, he lacked the requisite legal standing and dignity required for such a personal claim. However,
There's always a however in Roman law, isn't there?
pretty much, the owner could suffer in Uria through his slave, but compensation was only granted if the act done to the slave was particularly atrocious. And this is the key part, if it appeared openly intended to affront the master.
Ah, so it's not about the harm to the slave himself, but about the insult directed at the master via his property.
Precisely. The classic example given in the sources is the public whipping of someone else's enslaved person by an outsider. The actionable legal injury is suffered not by the person being whipped, but by the master whose property was damaged, yes, but more importantly, whose authority and social standing were openly challenged and insulted in public. It all comes back again and again to defining and defending relationships of proprietary power and social hierarchy.
Okay, one last area in delictual law. Let's quickly look at some of the, well, sometimes slightly quirky but very detailed rules surrounding theft, furta. The Romans seem to have loved fine distinctions here, too.
Oh, the jurists absolutely delighted in creating precise, sometimes hair-splitting, distinctions regarding furta or theft. For instance, there's a case discussed. If a man goes onto someone else's land, digs a pit to get chalk, and then carries the chalk away, he is legally considered a thief. Not necessarily because he was digging the pit that might be trespass or damage, but specifically because of the act of carrying away the chalk. The unauthorized removal and appropriation of the resource is the specific element that constitutes theft in this scenario.
That incredible attention to the precise legal moment or action that constitutes the offense. That Feels very characteristic of Roman law.
It really is. And here's another complex, maybe disturbing case involving a concept almost like self-theft. A runaway slave woman is legally regarded as stealing herself from her master.
Stealing herself.
Yes, and furthermore, if she gives birth while she's on the run, her child, born while she is technically stolen property, is also legally considered a stolen thing. The legal mechanism was designed to ensure the master's proprietary rights were relentlessly maintained, even against a person's fundamental desire for freedom.
Wow. Okay, what about a situation that seems simpler? What if a person lends something out and then secretly takes it back? Surely that's not theft, it's their own property.
Generally, you're right. It is not considered theft if a lender secretly retrieves an item he loaned out, precisely because the item remains his own property throughout the loan. Unless
The caveat.
the borrower had, in the meantime, acquired a special legal defensible right to keep the item temporarily, a right of retention.
Like what?
For example, if the borrower had incurred necessary expenses on the borrowed item, let's say they paid for vital repairs to keep it functional, that expenditure could give the borrower a temporary legal right, a lien almost, to retain the property until they were reimbursed.
Yeah.
In that specific narrow circumstance, if the lender then secretly took the item back without settling that claim, that act could constitute theft, furtum usus, theft of use, or even full theft, depending on intent. Why? Because he violated the borrower's legitimate temporary right of retention. It's these kinds of specific caveats and exceptions that really demonstrate the highly sophisticated and sometimes surprisingly equitable nuance that Roman law eventually achieved, even within strict categories.
It's a fascinatingly complex system. Okay, so these legal fragments, all stemming ultimately from that ancient idea of writing the law down in the 12 tables, clearly developed into this incredibly rigorous system governing pretty much every aspect of Roman life. But as you alluded to earlier, no system operates in a vacuum. Let's try to connect this legal rigor to the messier realities of Roman governance, particularly judicial procedure and the political instability that often plagued the empire.
That's a crucial connection to make. We absolutely have to look at the significant shift in judicial procedure that really took hold with the Principate, the rise of the emperors, and the massive expansion of the empire. This is the rise of what's called cognitio extra ordinum.
Cognitio extra ordinum, extraordinary jurisdiction.
Exactly. This procedure became the standard way Roman governors operated in the provinces. Think of people like Pliny the Younger dealing with Christians in Pontus, or the, very famous example of Pontius Pilate in Judea. The old republican system, the ordo, which was very citizen-centric and formal, just wasn't practical or suitable for governing millions of non-citizens, the peregrini, across vast territories.
So cognitio extra ordinum fundamentally marks that shift. From a citizen-focused republican rule of law to a more centralized, adaptable, perhaps more arbitrary imperial authority.
That's a very good way to put it. Under the old republican system, the legal procedure was heavily constrained by statutes and precedent. Under cognitio, however, the judge, who was usually the Roman governor or his representative, was largely free to proceed as he saw fit. He investigated, questioned, decided the sentence.
That sounds like it gives immense power, potentially quite arbitrary power, to the individual governor.
It certainly did. Our sources confirm that combining multiple charges in one hearing was common. The governor had wide discretion in using investigation methods, including torture, especially on non-citizens or slaves. And crucially, if the governor was asked to carry out an execution, perhaps confirming a sentence demanded by local authorities, he would typically enforce it according to Roman usage, like crucifixion, for example, not necessarily according to the local laws or customs of the peregrini.
That's a clear assertion of Roman dominance, isn't it? Rome's law and authority ultimately superseded all local custom when it came to final judgment.
Absolutely. It was a constant reinforcement of imperial power. But we also see examples of this same imperial authority being wielded, sometimes quite unilaterally, for acts of mercy. Or perhaps acts of political expediency dressed up as mercy.
Like what?
Well, there's a really fascinating anecdote in Josephus concerning Lucius Albinus, who was a Roman procurator, a governor of Palestine. Apparently, right at the very end of his term, just before his successor arrived. He decided to basically empty his prisons. He went through all the untried prisoners and those waiting execution and just dismissed them wholesale from his jurisdiction, let them go.
Just like that, on his own authority.
Just like that. It was presented as a pure, unconstrained act of imperium, his inherent power as governor to grant clemency or simply clear the books before leaving office. Now, these kinds of judicial acts could be highly volatile, of course. Later emperors or governors sometimes reversed sentences, like sentences of relegation or banishment, handed down by their predecessors. It shows the potential instability inherent in such centralized, often personality-driven, non-precedential authority.
Right. So the system had flexibility, but that also meant less predictability.
Yeah.
Now, shifting to the broader political landscape, our sources draw some really striking comparisons between corruption in the late Roman Republic and what was happening back in classical Greek politics.
Yeah.
It seems the definition of corruption itself was maybe a bit different, or at least nuanced.
That's a key point. In classical Greece, particularly thinking about the time of Demosthenes and Aeschines in Athens, when they were constantly accusing each other of taking bribes from Philip of Macedon.
Right, the great rivalry.
The core legal and political issue was quite nuanced. According to some interpretations mentioned in the sources, simply accepting money from foreigners who happened to be pleased with your existing political stance wasn't automatically seen as treasonous bribery. It might have even been common practice.
So what was the crime then?
The real crime, the Treasonous Act, lay specifically in betraying state interests for money, sacrificing the clear, manifest good of Athens in direct exchange for foreign gold. It was a crime defined largely by the negative policy outcome for the state, not just the financial transaction itself.
Okay, so how did Rome's experience with corruption compare, especially as the Republic was collapsing in the 1st century BC?
Well, by that stage, Rome seems to have moved well beyond that kind of subtlety in defining corruption based on political outcome. By the late Republic, corruption appears to have become absolutely systemic and crucially focused on the outright bribery of the judiciary itself.
Lying verdicts.
Exactly. Cicero, for example, who was right in the thick of it, openly mentioned the widespread practice of senatorial judges. The guys actually hearing the cases being paid off for favorable verdicts. And to give you a sense of the scale, he estimated, almost casually, the going rate for securing an acquittal for a praetorian man that's a former praetor, a very high-ranking official, maybe accused of extortion in his province, was no less than 3 million sesterces.
3 million sesterces. Just how much was that?
It's hard to give an exact modern equivalent, but put it this way. A legionary soldier at the time might earn maybe a few hundred sesterces a year. So 3 million was an absolutely astronomical sum. It represents a calculated, almost normalized integration of massive corruption into the very administration of justice at the highest levels. It really proves that even with meticulously written laws like the 12 Tables as a foundation, the application of that law could often be bought by the wealthy and powerful.
It just clearly illustrates that the legal rigor established way back wasn't always matched by the integrity of those charged with enforcing it, especially when the stakes were high. The law might have been public, but justice, it seems, remained very much negotiable for those with deep enough pockets.
Sadly, that appears to be the case in the late Republic.
And speaking of power structures undermining the law, we absolutely have to discuss the ultimate symbol, perhaps, of fragile Roman imperial authority, the Praetorian Guard. These guys weren't just a military unit, were they? They were a potent political force in their own right.
Oh, absolutely. They were supposed to be the elite protectors, right. A specialized force, eventually numbering over 20,000 highly chosen soldiers, stationed in and around Rome itself, dedicated to watching over the safety of the emperor and the capital city.
Sounds reasonable enough.
In theory. But they were distinguished by two crucial things, according to historians like Gibbon, quoted in our sources. First, a splendid, intimidating appearance, and second, critically, less rigid discipline compared to the regular legions fighting out on the frontiers.
Less rigid discipline. That sounds like a recipe for trouble in the heart of power.
And it was. That lack of discipline, combined with their proximity to the emperor and their awareness of their own power, turned them into the ultimate insider threat. They became the authors, or at least the key players, in almost every major imperial succession crisis, coup, or revolution for centuries.
And we have a particularly tragic, detailed anecdote in the sources that vividly illustrates the kind of brutal tyranny they could wield, even against the most respected figures in the state.
We do indeed. It concerns the murder of the incredibly wise and influential Praetorian prefect, Ulpian.
Ulpian, the great jurist whose writings we've been indirectly discussing.
The very same. Ulpian was one of the absolute giants of Roman jurisprudence, known as a friend of the laws, apparently revered by the people, and he was the chief advisor and praetorian prefect under the young emperor Alexander Severus in the early 3rd century AD.
So a powerful and respected figure. What happened?
The sources recount a furious 3-day mutiny by the Praetorian Guard stationed in Rome. They were likely angered by Ulpian's attempts to impose stricter discipline, and the outcome was horrific. Ulpian was hunted down and assassinated by his own guards, literally at the feet of the Emperor Alexander Severus himself in the imperial palace.
Murdered in front of the emperor. By the emperor's own bodyguards?
Exactly. And worse still, the young Emperor Alexander Severus was apparently powerless to prevent it, or even to properly avenge his friend and his own grossly insulted imperial dignity afterwards. The guards were simply too strong, too entrenched.
That single event, the murder of the highest legal authority in the empire in the presence of the emperor by the emperor's own guards, that is just a devastating illustration of the ultimate failure of centralized government and the rule of law when faced with raw, unaccountable military power.
It really is. It shows that the law could be written down, codified, meticulously defined by brilliant minds like Ulpians, debated in courts. But its enforcement, its very existence, ultimately collapsed when faced with an entrenched, armed power structure within the state that recognized no rule higher than its own immediate desires and perceived interests.
A sobering thought. So let's try to pull this all together. What we've really seen today by delving into these fragments of later Roman law is a system that took that initial, maybe simple principle of the written law from the 12 tables and just expanded it, elaborated it into a structure of truly staggering complexity and rigor.
Yeah, we've uncovered this world where the particular Roman genius seemed to lie in defining, categorizing, and assigning liability for almost everything, ensuring there was clear jurisdiction, a clear rule for almost every conceivable scenario, whether it involved, an insult directed at a family matron or damage done to a piece of property held as a pledge.
And we've really highlighted that profound legal distinction between Rome and, say, Athens. Athens, it seems, prized the autonomy and the political duties of the individual citizen participating in the polis, the city-state.
Whereas Rome emphasized almost obsessively the strictly defined, absolute, agnatically linked family unit, the familia, where pretty much every relationship was conceived as a structure of proprietary power and legal obligation, all designed primarily to eliminate ambiguity and enforce clear lines of authority.
The genius was definitely in the rigor, wasn't it? The ability to create these sophisticated legal workarounds like the actio utilis for injured freemen, or the fideicomissum, the trust, that allowed the law to evolve and handle increasingly complex commercial and social realities.
Yet, somehow, they still maintained fidelity, most of the time, to those core underlying principles of property rights and patriarchal authority that seem to have been established way back in the early civil law, possibly reflecting the spirit of the 12 tables.
It became, you could argue, the ultimate system of legal formalism, designed fundamentally to maintain order, perhaps, by exchanging the potential chaos of arbitrary personal rule for the predictable, if often incredibly unforgiving, framework of absolute legal definitions.
That sounds like a fair summary. Predictable, but often harsh.
Which leaves us, I think, with the enduring question. The 12 tables, created over 2,500 years ago, were meant to stop the power of the elite patricians from being secret and arbitrary. That was the goal, right? Transparency, equality before the law.
That was the ideal, yes.
But judging by the labyrinthine complexity and the sheer unforgiving rigor of the legal system that eventually grew out of them, a system that, as we've seen, often defined human relationships primarily as a series of proprietary rights, legal debts, and power imbalances, did the move toward universally visible, complex law actually empower the common Roman person in the long run? Or did it perhaps simply exchange the arbitrary judgment of a single magistrate for equally unforgiving, maybe even more suffocating, systems of rigorous legal formalism that benefited those who could navigate them best?
That's a profound question. Did it replace one form of constraint with another, perhaps more insidious one? A philosophical tension, maybe, that has defined the relationship between law, justice, and liberty ever since Rome?
Food for thought indeed. Join us next time on The Deep Dive.